Africa, here's a truism, Africa is a big place. To many people, it comes as a surprise just how big Africa is. I'm not trying to do a Who Wants to Be a Millionaire quiz here, but, you know, if we went through it, is Africa bigger than China? Well, everyone's pretty clear about that. Africa is bigger than China. What about China and the USA together? Probably, yes. What about China and the USA and the whole of Europe together? Well, not quite sure about that. What about China, the USA and Europe and the whole of India altogether? Well, there you'd begin to think, no, surely it's not quite that big, is it? In fact, Africa is the size of China and the USA and Europe and India and Argentina and New Zealand put together. They come to the same size as the land area of Africa. And those countries support a population of 3,240,000,000 people. 3 billion people in those countries, compared to Africa's 750,000 people. So the notion that Africa is an overpopulated country seems to me to be a completely nonsensical view of the way the world works. And in addition, the lack of people in Africa is a hold on the production of agricultural production. Because you look at where there's ecological devastation in Africa, what's needed in order to begin to repair it is actually more people. There's a famous Cape of Machakos, which is an area of Kenya, which in the 1930s was written off by colonialists as an example of desertification, the spread of deserts because of overpopulation. There's a famous report which goes as following: an appalling example of a large area of land which has been subjected to uncoordinated and practically uncontrolled development by natives whose multiplication and the increase of whose stock have been permitted free from the checks of war and largely from those of disease under benevolent British rule. So the problem was for Kenyans that the British had arrived, had imposed marvellous benevolent British rule, and because of this they had grown in large numbers and they had ruined the land. And this was accepted, this part of Kenya was accepted as semi-arid, it was falling apart, it was ecological devastation for a very long period, until, for various reasons I won't go into, the level of population in Machakos actually began to increase. The increase in population made it possible for terraces to be dug, for integrated crop livestock programs to become, for hedgerows and trees to be planted. And today Machakos has one of the highest populations in Africa per square kilometre, a population of 110 per square kilometre compared to the sub-Saharan African average of 24 per square kilometre. And yet at the same time, during the period of increase of population, the production of corn has quadrupled in Machakos because of the fact that enough people there make it possible to develop the land, to prevent ecological devastation, to work it in a way which is much more sensible. And therefore the notion that there are too many people in Africa is turning reality on its head. If there were more people, they could use the land better, they could produce more per head of the population, they could actually feed more people. And therefore, really one comes very quickly to the conclusion that Africa's problems are political problems. That it's not about too many people. It's not about ecological devastation. It's not about too little food. It's not about any geographical, technical question. The reality is that Africa's problems are political, that people starve because they are poor. In every famine, this is true of every famine across the globe, incidentally, but in every famine in Africa, there is always food available. Always food available, if you have the money to pay for it. That's the reality. And there is always enough food available for the rich and their hangers-on to survive. They're not the people who perish during famines. Nobody is rich has ever perished during a famine. Either they move or they buy the food that's available on the market. And the day-to-day reality of people's lives in Africa is that it is because they are poor that they are malnourished. That's the reality of why 250 million people in Africa are malnourished, because there simply is not enough money in their pockets to buy the food that is available. And why are these people poor? They are poor because of the way that the political and economic structure of the world exists, and because of the policies of organisations like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund and the World Trade Organisation, and because of the multinationals, and also because of the policies of the local ruling classes, who themselves share in the plunder of African people and who act in consort with multinationals across the globe. And you see, the ultimate proof that it's capitalism to blame. It's the way capitalism has developed in Africa that makes the social emergency particularly clear. Is that Africa has not always been poor in comparison with other parts of the world. Not at all is this true. In fact, for large periods of Africa's history, it's been one of the leaders in the vanguard of human development across the world. Let me tell you, British colonialists did not build the pyramids. The pyramids were built 4,000 years ago by Egyptians, by Africans. The Aksum civilization, one of the earliest civilizations in the northern highlands of Ethiopia, stone buildings from the 7th century, from the 5th century, the first stone buildings from the 7th century had developed city-style stone building formations. At a time when in Britain the 7th century was what? The Jutes. Desperate, low-level, barbarian people strutting around with no notion of any sort of real human development, who if someone had arrived from the northern highlands of Ethiopia, they would have thought they were from another planet. Literally they would have thought they were, because they would be so developed, so remarkably different to the low level of development which they had achieved, they would have thought they were gods. The Zanz culture of Eastern Africa, which formed a series of city-states from Mogadishu in Somalia all the way down to what is now Maputo in Mozambique, a linked city of city-states from the 7th century. The Katanga area of what's now the Democratic Republic of Congo developed copper mining from the 10th century, far in advance of anything that existed in Europe. The ironworking of Nigeria, the area which is now Nigeria, from the earliest period, far in advance of the majority of Africa. The empires of Mali, which is now in the area of Ghana, the Benin area, which amazed when visitors came from the West to see these places. They were shocked by the level of human development that existed, of the wealth, of the opulence, of a ruling class, of course, of an opulent, wealthy, gold-using, trading ruling class, but also even of the ordinary people who lived much better than the ordinary people back in the areas which they had come from. So, the notion that Africa has always been poor is exploded by the reality that for long periods of human history, Africa was in the vanguard of human development. Africa's problem is that capitalism did not develop here first. Chris Harman is doing a meeting on why capitalism developed first in the West. I won't go through it all. But, capitalism is not just about trade. Capitalism is also about changes in the forces of production. It's about wage labour being more productive than the old system. It's also about the ability to break the resistance of the old regime against new forms of capitalist development. And for whatever detailed reasons, this did not happen first in Africa. It happened first in Western Europe. And therefore, the engine of capitalist development was in Western Europe, and then, as capitalism rooted itself in order to carry out primitive accumulation, to get the early levels of wealth that were necessary to expand, capitalism then used slavery as a system in order to pump out massive amounts of wealth in order to drive the system forward. Every brick of the traders' buildings in Bristol and in Liverpool is stained with the blood of African slaves. That's the reality of how capitalism developed across the world. And Africa, not the first place that was used for slaves, but very quickly was the centre for the slave trade. Starting in the 15th century, by the 18th century, 1,200 people a week were being transported across the Atlantic from the west coast of Africa. And by 1870, up to 13 million people had been taken from Africa to work in the plantations of the eastern seaboard and of the Caribbean. People, I don't have to describe to you the most humiliating treatment used in